Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the third lecture in this centenary series of London lectures brought to you by the Royal Institute of Philosophy. It's a great pleasure to welcome this evening our speaker, Fiona Woollard. Fiona is Professor of Philosophy at Southampton University. She has written a lot about normative and applied ethics, and her book, Doing and Allowing Harm, was published by OUP in 2015. More recently, she's turned her attention to issues in the philosophy of pregnancy, sex, and motherhood, and that's what she's going to be talking about this evening. And if I remember rightly, because something else is on the screen right now, it's why should philosophers need to think about pregnancy? Fiona, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you for coming here and spending your time listening to me. So, everyone in this room and everywhere else on the planet is here as a result of pregnancy. The average global total fertility rate, which attempts to estimate the number of children by the average woman, is 2.3 children per woman. That doesn't take into account miscarriages and abortions. A 35-year-old woman who has 2 children, 2 years apart, may have spent 5 years or 1/7 of her life trying to get pregnant, being pregnant, or recovering from pregnancy. And her 45-year-old friend who maybe struggled to get pregnant, experienced miscarriages, may have spent more than a decade of her life trying to get pregnant, being pregnant, recovering from pregnancy. NHS England reported 554,235 booking appointments. These are the appointments where you go to your midwife and say, I'm pregnant, please give me antenatal care. They reported 54,235 of these appointments in the month of June in 2025. So, pregnancy is a fundamental part of human life. Being or becoming pregnant or recovering from pregnancy take up a relatively significant amount of time for a large proportion of the population. Pregnancy is also deeply strange and interesting. It involves growing another human being inside your body, which changes your body, all areas of your body. When I was pregnant, I needed to get glasses because it changed how my eyes were working. So it changes your body in unexpected ways. In this deeply intimate process that transforms your body and perhaps your sense of self. It pushes your body to feats that are similar to those that are performed by elite athletes, ultra-marathon runners. You use the same kind of energy use during pregnancy, just existing during pregnancy, as ultra-marathon runners use. Yet, pregnancy has been comparatively neglected by philosophers, particularly by analytic philosophers. This is slowly starting to change, and now we're beginning to see really exciting work in the metaphysics of pregnancy, the epistemology of pregnancy, and the ethics of pregnancy, and in other areas of philosophy of pregnancy. So, what I want to do in this talk today is to explore how philosophy can help us understand pregnancy and how it can help improve the treatment of those who are pregnant, and also how philosophy can help, how pregnancy can help philosophy by challenging us to rethink the way that we approach philosophical issues, the things that we take for granted in our standard philosophical ideas and methods. And these aspects are kind of intertwined. So the talk isn't going to be, here's how philosophers can help us understand pregnancy, and then here's how pregnancy can help us challenge philosophy. I'm going to discuss the two things at the same time. I just wanted to quickly say something about language. So most people who are pregnant are women, but not all. I think the fact that most people who are pregnant are women does affect our understanding of pregnancy and how people who are pregnant are treated. And I want my language to recognize this. But I also want to recognize that not all people who are pregnant are women. So I'm going to use a mixture of what we call gender neutral language, where I just talk about those who are pregnant, and gender additive language, where I might talk about pregnant women, trans men, and non-binary people. So, I want to begin by talking about work that's been done in the metaphysics of pregnancy. So there's an incredibly well-named project, the BUMP project, Better Understanding the Metaphysics of Pregnancy. I have, since hearing about this project, sought to find an acronym for a research project that is as good as this and never succeeded. This is headed by my friend and former colleague, Elselijn Kingma. Elselijn asked us to consider the metaphysics of pregnancy, the relationship between the pregnant organism and the fetus. The question that she asked is the fetus part of the pregnant organism, like a tail on a cat? Or is it separate but inside the pregnant organism, like a tub of yogurt in the fridge? As part of that research project, we saw other alternatives being put forward, such as Alex Geddes' suggestion that the fetus and the gravida, the pregnant organism, are overlapping organisms. And Sophie Menke's suggestion that we shouldn't be thinking in terms of organisms at all. We should instead be thinking about processes, and that's a better way to understand the metaphysics of pregnancy. If these questions about the metaphysics of pregnancy have interesting implications for ethics. So if the parenthood view is true, then the fetus is a part of the pregnant person's body. Now, an idea that's really fundamental in much of Western ethics is the idea that you own your body. And if you own your body, you own all the parts of your body. So if the parenthood view is true, then we face a question. Are pregnant people different from most humans in that they don't own all the parts of their body? Or should we say that a pregnant person owns their fetus? Now, there are other puzzles which are kind of similar to this. There's a puzzle called the problem of the fruits, which is the question about whether we own our children. Because generally, if you own something, you own the fruits of that thing. So if you own a tree, and the tree gives forth apples, you own the apples. But I think that the pregnancy-based question is really much more interesting and challenging, because it's relatively simple to say, okay, if you own your body, you own the fruits of that, unless there's some reason that you can't. For example, if those fruits are human beings who own themselves. But in the pregnancy case, if we say you don't own the fetus, and we think the fetus is a part of your body, then we're really challenging your self-ownership, your ownership over your own body. You're not losing ownership of something that's sprung from your body, but a fundamental part of the body itself. So if we go that way, if we say pregnant people don't own all the parts of their bodies, then that is, I think, going to be really putting pregnant people in a different position than those who are not pregnant. On the other hand, saying that you actually own your fetus is also, I think, in many ways counterintuitive. Often I think we might well want to say that even though pregnant people have lots of rights to decide what happens to the fetus, because that's part of them deciding what happens to their own body, to say that the fetus itself is something that belongs to the pregnant woman is, I think, further than many people would want to go. So thinking about pregnancy and the metaphysics of pregnancy can force us to address really difficult questions about how we reconcile the kind of reality of pregnancy and the wish to recognize the kind of full humanity and moral status of people who can become pregnant. I think there are lots of ways in which thinking about pregnancy and ethics is important. One way in which philosophers can help improve the treatment of those who are pregnant by thinking about the ethics of pregnancy is by uncovering implicit premises in the way that people reason about pregnancy. And I think there are a couple of there are a lot of examples here that I could give, but in order to try and keep somewhat to time, I chose two to discuss. So one of the examples I wanted to discuss is, it's my friend Elselijn again. So she has this paper, which for a long time when we were talking about it, we called the Invisible Mothers paper. It's actually ended up being called Improving Our Thinking, I think. But this paper looked at the reporting of the place of birth study. So this was a really big study, well-funded, well-designed study, which was run in 2011. And it basically looked at how does where you give birth affect the outcomes for the mother and the baby. It specifically looked at pregnancies which were classified as low risk. Now, the results of this study were really interesting. The results were that planning a hospital birth rather than a home birth increases the risk of harm for all mothers, decreases the risk of harm for firstborn babies, and has no effect on second and subsequent babies. Now, Elselijn looked at the way in which these findings were reported, and what she found was that they were reported as home birth poses increased risks for first babies. The message that home births decrease risks for mothers, and that there doesn't make any difference for second and subsequent babies, that wasn't mentioned, or it appeared much lower in the reporting as a kind of aside. Sometimes it wasn't mentioned at all. And Elselijn asks, what's going on when we take those results and report them in this way? And Elselijn says, it tells us something about the hidden value system. Crudely put, it reveals the hidden value claim: harms to babies are of far greater concern than harms to mothers. Or even more worryingly, only harms to babies matter, harms to mothers do not. Now, Elselijn then goes on to say she's not accusing the people reporting this study of explicitly failing to care about mothers. She's not saying anyone involved actually endorses this claim. She says the whole point of making hidden value claims explicit is to open them up to scrutiny and reflection, which often instantly reveals them to be either unsupportable or at least unsupported by us, prompting revision. And I think this is a really important thing that philosophers can do, and one of the reasons why philosophers need to think about pregnancy. Because often, in the way that the general public thinks about pregnancy and reasons about pregnancy, there are these implicit value claims which, once you bring them to light, once you say, look, this is what you are implicitly appealing to, hopefully should make people stop and say, okay, no, I do not want to endorse the claim that only harms to babies matter, harms to mothers do not. Another case that I wanted to discuss is sodium valproate. So sodium valproate is a drug that's used to treat epilepsy. It's a very effective drug in the treatment of epilepsy, and there are a fair number of people for whom this is the only really effective treatment that can control their epilepsy. Now, that sounds great. Sounds like everybody would be very keen on this drug. The problem is that sodium valproate does indeed have bad effects if it's taken during pregnancy. So, how should we respond to this? Well, the World Health Organization responds to this by putting sodium valproate on a PPP, pregnancy prevention plan. So, the idea is that sodium valproate should not be a first-line treatment for girls and women of childbearing potential. So girls and women of childbearing potential includes any girl who has hit puberty. So we could be talking about a 10-year-old here. If you do wish to use sodium valproate and you were a girl or woman of childbearing potential, then you must have mandatory contraception. You must be on a long-acting permanent contraceptive, such as a contraceptive implant. Even if you are a 10-year-old, and so therefore not having sex yet, hopefully, or celibate for religious reasons, or not attracted to people who you could have sex with and then get pregnant. So even if you're gay. And you also have to have an annual risk acknowledgement form where you confirm that you've received adequate counselling surrounding the risks of this drug in pregnancy. So Rachel Arkell, who's done some really interesting work on sodium valproate, argues that what's embedded in this approach is the assumption that because you could conceive, preventing fetal exposure to a potential fetus needs to be the most important priority in choosing medicine. Arkell says, such an approach is inherently sexist, and unfortunately, this is not the first time that the WHO has chosen to treat women and girls of childbearing potential in this way. So the assumption is, even though you may be too young to have sex, or you may be quite clear that you're not planning to have sex, you can't be trusted not to become pregnant. And should you become pregnant, this tiny, tiny risk of this hypothetical fetus matters more than access to a medicine that may be the only way to control life-threatening epilepsy. So I think that's one thing that philosophers can do when we think about pregnancy. We can identify the underlying assumptions that are operating in how people are reasoning about pregnancy. And I think that's an important thing for philosophers to do. Some of the other things that philosophers might do, again, in ways that we might hopefully improve the treatment of those who are pregnant or might become pregnant, is to look at ways in which thinking about pregnancy fails to really appreciate the nature of pregnancy and wrongly uses analogies which don't recognize what pregnancy is actually like. So one that I've done some work on with Elselijn is pregnancy and the doing-allowing distinction. So here we're seeing analogies between suboptimal behavior in pregnancy, such as smoking while pregnant, or drinking alcohol while pregnant, or failing to follow the optimal diet while pregnant. And these are sometimes compared to child abuse or child neglect, or compared to third parties causing harm to fetuses, third-party fetal injuries. And we want to argue that this is a mistake because the fact that the interactions are taking place between a person who's pregnant and their fetus makes an incredibly important difference. Now, you hear people say things like, why should location make a difference? Why should where a baby is make a difference? And I think that the fact that the fetus is inside or part of a pregnant person does indeed make a huge ethical difference because it changes how fundamental ethical concepts apply. So we're going to focus just a little bit on this doing-allowing distinction. So oftentimes, suboptimal behavior in pregnancy is framed as doing harm to the fetus. And this matters because in common sense morality, we treat the difference between doing harm and merely allowing harm as morally significant. In particular, we have really strong general constraints against doing harm. So if I'm about to do harm to somebody, we don't need to know anything about my relationship to that person. We don't need to appeal to special obligations that I have to protect that person, to aid that person. We don't need to know if that person is my daughter or my husband or a stranger, because we all owe a general duty to everyone not to do harm. And we all have these general protections against other people doing harm to us. In contrast, if I'm thinking about maybe allowing harm to somebody, then if we're going to say that I'm not permitted to do that, we might well need to appeal to some sort of special obligation that I have. So framing the pregnant person's behaviour as doing harm acts as what we call a justificatory bypass. It allows you to say, I'm not going to get into any questions about what pregnant people owe their fetuses. We don't need to kind of argue for those, because this is just one person doing harm to another. And constraints against doing harm don't need to appeal to special obligations. So this justificatory bypass allows people to condemn the behaviour of pregnant women, or even to justify sanctions or even coercion without getting into these complicated issues. And I'm thinking here of a whole range of responses. So we can have responses like just judging, looking down on you, saying you shouldn't be doing that. We can have people kind of interfering. So when a bartender might refuse to serve a pregnant woman alcohol because they think they have to protect the fetus against the pregnant woman doing harm to them, all the way up to forced caesarean sections, where a judge orders that a pregnant person must have a caesarean section against their will in order to protect the fetus. So we've got quite a range of different examples here. And these are all much easier to justify if you can just say, these are cases of doing harm, so we don't need to ask complicated questions about what exactly you take on, what exactly you agree to when you become pregnant and what you owe your fetus. So you might think, okay, sounds like it matters whether pregnant people are doing harm or not doing harm to their fetus. But at least in some cases, it looks like they are. I mean, if you're smoking, if you're drinking alcohol, if you're eating food that's bad for the fetus, these all look like they're cases of doing harm. But we think that it's actually more complicated than that. And this is because these things that the pregnant person does only affect the fetus through the effects on the pregnant person's body. So if you think of the pregnant person's body as a kind of life support system for the fetus, it is, we might think, a barrier to harm, something that's protecting the fetus. Now, philosophers who are interested in the doing-allowing distinction have talked quite a lot about barriers to harm. So, barriers to harm, many people think, are interesting and different. If you remove a barrier to harm, even though you're doing something active, you might not count as doing harm. The big constraint against doing harm might not apply. So, for example, turning off a life support machine. That looks like you're removing a barrier to harm. In some cases, we might want to call that just letting somebody die. Barrier removal cases are also interesting because it looks as if when we're talking about barrier removal, it really matters what the claims are to the barrier. So Shelley Kagan has this very nice pair of cases. In one case, we have a sadly injured person. The doctors decide in conjunction with the parents that they need to turn off the life support machine, and the person dies. That looks like allowing harm. In the other case, Shelley says, the person in the accident is my rival for this prestigious philosophy prize. And he wants this prize so much, Kagan, that he's prepared to sneak into the hospital and turn off the life support machine because it's the greatest living philosopher prize. So if his rival kicks the bucket before the cutoff point, then the prize is going to go to Kagan. He does put this in the first person, so obviously we're having a window into his psyche here. And Kagan points out that when he sneaks into the ward and turns off that life support machine, he seems to be doing harm there. And we don't need to appeal to any special relationship to say that that's not something that he's permitted to do. So, when you are affecting somebody because you're acting on a barrier, this behavior doesn't behave like a typical doing of harm, and it looks like questions of who owns the barrier matter a lot. Maybe they matter about, they affect how we classify the behavior, or maybe they affect how we think what we think of the ethics of the behavior. There is disagreement about that, but lots of people think that they matter in some way. And pregnancy is a barrier case. It's a case in which you affect somebody because you're acting on a barrier to harm, and your behavior only affects them because they are using that barrier to protect themselves. If they weren't using the barrier, then you could do the thing that you want to do without affecting them. The cases like smoking and drinking they might sometimes be kind of partial removal of barrier cases. So there's uncertainty about exactly how smoking affects the fetus. One possible mechanism is that it affects the fetus because it reduces the amount of oxygen that gets to the fetus. Now that looks like you are partially removing an element of the life support machine. So you were giving lots of oxygen to the fetus, and now you're giving less oxygen. So you're not, your life support machine isn't as good. Another possible mechanism for the effects on the fetus of smoking during pregnancy is that we have nasty things, poisons, going from the cigarettes into the fetus's bloodstream. So that isn't the removal of a barrier. It's a new type of barrier case, which we call barrier contamination. So this is a case where you affect someone by making the thing that's still overall beneficial to them in some way harmful to them. So you're kind of corrupting or contaminating that barrier. Philosophers haven't really thought about what we should say about barrier contamination before. So this is a case in which pregnancy helps philosophers because it helps us to recognize a new type of case for this old chestnut of a philosophical problem, how we should think about the difference between doing and allowing harm. But we also think that it's philosophers can help improve the treatment of pregnant women, pregnant people, by suggesting that maybe we shouldn't be so quick to treat their behaviour as doing harm. Because if it's a barrier contamination, then we think barrier contaminations might be actually kind of similar to barrier removals in that they're not standard doings of harm. Now, as a philosopher, I love coming up with thought experiments. So this is the thought experiment to try and think about how we should treat barrier contamination cases. It's a kind of convoluted thought experiment because pregnancy is really weird and strange. Generally, if you want to smoke or if you want to drink, you can go away and do this in a place where it's not going to affect anybody else. So it's quite difficult to come up with cases where the only way in which you can do something is by affecting a barrier that somebody else is relying on. So the case we came up with was, imagine that you are working in a factory. And this is really not a very nice worker-friendly factory. They require you to bring your own plate to eat lunch. If you don't have a plate, you may not eat lunch. You also work in shifts, and the shifts are not allowed, people in different shifts are not allowed to talk to each other. So you know that somebody in the shift behind has forgotten their plate. So you have a choice. You can leave your plate for them, and then they will be able to eat lunch. If you don't leave your plate, they won't be able to eat lunch. They'll be really hungry. That will be bad. You use caffeine powder to stay awake and help keep productive during your shift. If you don't have your caffeine powder, then that's going to make you less productive. You're going to find it much harder to stay awake. The person who's forgotten their plate has a mild caffeine allergy. So you have to face the question, I'm going to leave the plate because the worst outcome is that they don't get to eat lunch. Can I have my caffeine? Can I mix my caffeine on my plate, knowing that this is going to contaminate the plate, which will still be benefiting them overall, but it will mean that it has some things which are going to be not good for them. I think that case is really different from a case in which you've given somebody your plate and then you independently need to kind of poison them with the caffeine in order to have your caffeine. Because the only reason in which that you can't have your caffeine is because they are using your plate. I think the fact that it's your plate makes a big difference. If it was a shared plate, then it would be ethically very different for you to use caffeine powder to contaminate it. If it was their plate, it would be very different. So I think that barrier contamination cases like plate have a lot in common with barrier removal cases. And really importantly, we can't work out what you're required to do without really looking into questions about, who owns the resources? What kind of claims do people have to those resources? And if the resource is the body of the person who's pregnant, then I think there are two. So one thing you might say is, it's their body, so they get to decide what to do with it. Nobody has any claims on it. And then I think they count as basically merely allowing harm. I think you could argue that there is some kind of claim. If you've agreed to carry a fetus to term, then you have given that fetus some kind of claim to use your body. But if you're going to say that, you really need to get into the nitty-gritty about what duties people take on when they become pregnant. So we can't use this justificatory bypass. We can't say, it's doing harm, so they can't do it. I don't need to worry about the duties of pregnant people. So that's basically our argument, that when you look into the way in which the doing allowing distinction interacts with pregnancy, you see that you can't classify behavior as doing harm and use that to avoid these really difficult questions about what duties you take on when you become pregnant. Okay, now I'm kind of doing a bit of a whirlwind tour. I'm trying to look at lots of different ways in which I think it's important for philosophers to think about pregnancy. And the final one I want to look at is pregnancy and objectification. So you're probably most familiar with the idea of objectification associated with sexual objectification. So feminists for several decades now have been arguing that it's not okay for men to objectify women and that women are often sexually objectified. I think that when we look at the way in which people are treated during pregnancy and also the way we think about mothers, we see a different kind of objectification, which I call reproductive objectification. So we can think of sexual objectification as treating someone as if they are merely an object that is designed for sexual gratification. Reproductive objectification treats people who can become pregnant as if they are merely an object, a tool for reproducing. And I think recognizing that there can be this different type of objectification is useful in two ways. So I think first, it helps us to understand a lot of what we see around us in terms of the ways in which people are treated during pregnancy. And secondly, it actually leads us to consider the concept of objectification. So one of the most famous accounts of objectification is the Nussbaum-Langton account. This starts from Martha Nussbaum's account of objectification. Nussbaum says, in all cases of objectification, what is at issue is a question of treating one thing as another. One is treating as an object what is really not an object, what is in fact a human being. And then Nussbaum gives us 7 ways in which we can treat human beings like objects. These include instrumentalization, so treating a person as a tool for achieving one's purposes. They include lots of other ones which I've forgotten. I've not got my list. There are lots of 7 different ways in which we can treat humans as objects, according to Nussbaum. And then Ray Langton comes along and she adds some additional ways in which we can treat people as objects, including silencing and reduction to body. And I think that we see different kinds of treating people as objects when we look at how pregnant people are treated. So the ways in which pregnant people disappear from our reasoning, in which we just ignore harms to people who are giving birth. Remember that study that Kingma reported. I think that's instrumentalization, a denial of subjectivity. You'll often see pictures of just a pregnant belly. My picture here. Sorry, the computer is telling me that I might want to plug in my PC because it's running low. Okay, it's gone away. If you search for images of pregnancy, you will see loads and loads of pregnant bellies with headless torsos with just a pregnant belly. And that's a kind of reduction to body. I think that lots of the ways in which we talk about pregnancy involve a kind of objectification, kind of treating like an object. There's a PhD student called Rebecca Brion who's doing some really interesting work on silencing during labour. So she argues that it's not possible in many cases to refuse interventions during birth because the situation in the birthing room is such that if you try and refuse, that will not be recognised as a refusal. It'll just be seen as you're obviously tired or don't know what you're thinking. So that's a case in which we have silencing, which is a form of objectification. So I think we do see objectification in pregnancy. But Nussbaum also says something interesting about objectification. So Nussbaum argues that sexual objectification may sometimes not be bad. It might be a wonderful part of our sexual lives. Okay, so Nussbaum gives lots of literary examples, drawing quite heavily on the work of D.H. Lawrence, which involves kind of sexual encounters where you sort of have a very deep, primal experience, kind of lose your sense of yourself as a separate person and have this kind of magical union with the other. And Nussbaum says, that sounds great, but notice that you're becoming kind of object-like. And maybe that's amazing. So she concludes that maybe objectification isn't always a bad thing, but it can be wonderful. And in fact, I think if you think about pregnancy, then that's maybe a more easily graspable, maybe more kind of common case in which we might think that some of the ways in which we become object-like in pregnancy are actually really valuable. So one form of objectification is a blurring of your boundaries. So the idea is people have really strict boundaries and other people are not allowed to go into those boundaries. When you become pregnant, you have a fetus existing within your bodily boundaries. And I think that challenges our bodily autonomy during pregnancy. I think sometimes that can be something that's quite psychologically hard to deal with, but it's not completely a negative experience. Many people think that there's something actually amazing about sharing your body with this fetus that you're growing, this child that you're growing. We also, when we have children, we do become instruments. We do put ourselves at the service of those children. And that being useful in that way isn't always a bad thing. We also, I think, recognize the ways in which we depend upon others. So when you have children, often in order to meet the needs of those children, you rely on the help of other people. So if we think about pregnancy, then we're forced to rethink the idea of humans as ideally existing in a glorious isolation in which they have strict boundaries that no one ever gets to cross. That's not what pregnancy is like. And it's not really what human life should be like. So I think that pregnancy causes us to kind of really, it backs up Nussbaum's claim that not all ways of treating someone like an object are bad. Now, I don't agree with Nussbaum that not all objectification is bad. I think we should redefine objectification. We shouldn't accept Nussbaum's claim that in objectification you're treating as an object what is really not an object, what is in fact a human being. Because human beings are in fact objects, and they are useful to other people, and sometimes they have fuzzy boundaries which other people cross. I think we should define objectification as treating a human being as an object in a way that's incompatible with proper treatment of a human being. That means that objectification is by definition bad because it's inappropriate treatment. It's incompatible with appropriate treatment of a human being. It means that we're going to have to think seriously when we see someone treating someone as an object about whether that treatment is compatible with treating them as a human being. So is this treating them as an object because human beings are objects and so appropriate, or is it treating them as an object in a way that fails to recognize that they are not just an object, that they are in fact a human being? And I think that when it comes to pregnancy, some ways in which we treat pregnant people are in fact objectification. They're treating the pregnant people as objects in ways that are incompatible with the proper treatment of a human being. So when we ignore the fact that where you give birth has effects on the well-being of the person giving birth and only focus on the potential risks to the baby, that is reproductive objectification. That is treating the pregnant person in a way that's incompatible with how we should treat human beings. But not all ways in which we treat somebody as an object during pregnancy are incompatible with how we should treat human beings. So I think this really brings out the challenges in the ethics of pregnancy. So I think we need to recognize the distinctive nature and value of pregnancy and parenthood, and be aware of how this requires us to rethink kind of standard claims or standard approaches in ethics, which really typically assume separate, independent adults, because we are not always separate, or even are we ever really separate, really independent adults. But we need to, at the same time, resist reproductive objectification and insist on the full value and personhood of women, trans men, and non-binary people, whether they're pregnant, whether they're considering becoming pregnant, or whether they are 10-year-old girls who have no intention of becoming pregnant and just need some sodium valproate. So I think I may have gone slightly over time, although I don't know whether the interruption makes that okay. So I'll just let that be my concluding thoughts and invite questions after I've spoken to Teddy.
Going right back to the beginning of the talk on the metaphysics of pregnancy, I suppose one challenge might go like this, that if you said to one member of a pair of Siamese twins, do you think your twin is more like a cat's tail or like a tub of yogurt in the fridge? They'd probably say, oh, come off it, why do I have to choose between those two alternatives? Is it just refusing to do philosophy properly to say, well, that couldn't the relationship between a mother and the child that she's carrying be sui generis?
That's a really nice question. I think I would not be opposed to the idea that it is different from any other relationship. It's different from the conjoined twins case, because in the conjoined twins case, you have two people who come into existence at the same time and then kind of fuse, whereas in the pregnancy case, you have very definitely a pre-existing organism and then the secondary one, and that might make a difference to how we want to regard them. It might not, but it might. To be honest, I think it would be okay to conclude that the relationship is sui generis. That would already be kind of a revolution, because the yogurt in the fridge, sort of, or what Elselijn calls the fetal container model, is really widely assumed, just taken for granted in lots of places. So even just pointing out that that's not the model is, I think, a really interesting move.
Okay. Yeah.
So whatever your conclusion is, if the conclusion is it's not a yogurt in a fridge, I think that's quite, that's going to matter.
Good, thank you. Okay, so moving on to the sort of next bit of the talk, a lot of the puzzles about pregnancy, if I understood you rightly, are generated by trying to fit pregnancy or the relationship between the mother and the unborn child into an ownership model. And I just wondered whether, the problem of the fruits, I think you called it. Do you think that thinking about ownership of one's own body, thinking about one's relationship to one's own body as an ownership relation is local to a culture that is particularly interested in private property, profit, inheritance and all that, and in a culture in which people were less interested in that, less individualistic, they might not start off from the idea of the problem of the fruits and ownership?
I mean, I do think that we own our bodies. I think ownership is probably best thought of as a kind of bundle of claims over a resource. If the resource comes with a kind of label attached, then, and somebody who has the right, has certain specific rights over it, then we should say that we own it or it belongs to us in some morally important sense. I think one of the great kind of divides in ethics is how seriously we take the individual versus the collective. And I think all ethical systems are attempting to figure out how to kind of balance those things. But I do think that your body is just a resource that comes with a label attached. And so if we don't recognize that, if we just think of it as a kind of something collective that belongs to the collective, we're missing something. But I do agree that different cultures are going to put different weight on that kind of those individual rights, those individual that individual relationship, depending upon how they solve this big problem of how to balance individuality versus the collective.
Right, thank you. Now, there was something you said at the very end about boundaries, and this is not how human life should be. But I can't think of any question to ask you about that other than please say more, so I won't ask you that. Well, you can ask it. In the doing and allowing bit of the paper, how distinctive are the problems in the sort of ethics of the perinatal situation, as distinct from other cases in which people are responsible for others? So you might become responsible for an old person, you might be responsible for a child. Well, here's this other creature, you're responsible for it, and just because that's how things have panned out. You know, you're in an accident, car accident with somebody, they're more injured than you become responsible for their care. What's distinctive about the perinatal setup, if anything?
I mean, I think that pregnancy challenges our bodily boundaries in a way that very few other situations do. It's also different in that it's unrelenting. So I think pregnancy would be hugely different if you could just take a break. You know, if you could be pregnant for like 8 hours a day and then have some time off at night where you could go off and live a normal life. So I think the two things that really set it apart are the deep physiological entwinement and the fact that it is non-stop for around 9 months. So it's an extended period of non-separation, of intertwinement. And I think that makes it very different from, I mean, I'm not saying that there are no other cases. I'm not saying that there are no other actual cases in which that happens. And I'm certainly not going to say that philosophers can't come up with an example in which that happens using the resources of science fiction. But I think it's distinctive and different from most cases, and it's difficult to come up with analogies. You know, our plate case is really weird because we had to work hard to find something that had the features that pregnancy has.
Wonderful. Thank you. I've said quite enough. Over to you. Questions, please. There is a roving mic. Yes, right at the front.
Thanks. Going back to that beginning thing, the tail and the yogurt, beautiful images. You talked about pregnancy as though it was the same all the way through. Do people not discuss, well, maybe it starts as a tail and then becomes a yogurt? And when does that happen? And why does one thing make it change from one to the other?
That is a really interesting question. So actually it might start as a yogurt and then become a tail because pre-implantation, there is, at the beginning, there's something that floats about and that isn't attached. However, after implantation, you get a kind of physiological entwinement, which means that they can't be separated without a significant event, birth. And so I think that there is, although there are massive differences between what the fetus kind of looks like from implantation all the way up to just before it's born, there actually is a big difference between a fetus that is at term, ready to be born, and a baby that has been born, because there is no longer that kind of intertwinement after birth. After birth, there is a separation. So I don't know of any view which says we go from tail to yogurt. And I think that is because it's difficult to argue. It would be difficult to argue for such a view because there is this kind of intertwinement right up until birth.
You're frowning. Do you want to come back?
I suppose I might be partly confusing it with the implications of whether it's a tail or a yogurt. That tail seems to bring with it more idea of it is yours and therefore you should have total control, whereas if it's a yogurt, it's something separate and other people might have some rights or it might have rights of its own. And when you're thinking about it in those terms, the actual birth event doesn't seem especially significant.
So I think birth is ethically really significant, but I do agree that the development seems to be ethically significant too. But so if you really want to bring out that kind of puzzle, that kind of challenge that I was thinking about, think about that fetus at 37 weeks. And think about what if that is a part of your body? Can we say you own it? So I think what we get is gradually greater conflict between the fetus's interests or the moral, the kind of the significance of the fetus, and the fact that it is either inside, enclosed in, or part of somebody's body. So I think that the metaphysics is not going to change, but it does get ethically more and more tricky. I mean, to be honest, I think it's ethically quite tricky even at the embryo stage. But if you think about the 37-week fetus, that really, really makes it seem hard to say, that you own that.
Yes, over there.
Hello, I had the privilege of being one of your students at Southampton a long time ago, and it's a delight to hear you talk again. So thank you very much for your presentation. I want to tread quite carefully because obviously I know nothing about pregnancy. I'd be really curious to hear your thoughts about reproductive objectification. So one of the things that sprung to my mind was we can, and maybe I'm probably putting this the wrong way, but we can treat someone as both a means to an end as well as an end in themselves at the same time. They can have instrumental value and final value, and the two aren't mutually exclusive. And it seems like this is often how we kind of, hopefully as a minimum, treat others. And I just wonder if you would be happy. So one, is this the right way of sort of phrasing objectification? And then two, if we can treat pregnant people as ends in themselves as well as means to ends, what might that, if anything, imply for reproductive objectification?
Thank you. Nice to see you again. I think you're absolutely right that we do instrumentalize people all the time, and we do treat them and we treat them at the same time as ends. I think reproductive objectification occurs when we don't, like when we instrumentalize to such an extent that we're no longer recognizing their humanity. I think pregnancy is interesting though, and kind of challenges our understanding of what might count as objectification, because you might normally think that bodily integrity, for example, is one of the limits on instrumentalization. So I cannot treat you as a means in a way that involves violating your bodily integrity. You need to have a say over who goes past your bodily boundaries. And pregnancy involves losing some of that say. You might think, oh, okay, what if maybe we just say you have to have consented to be pregnant. But actually, normally, when I consent to people crossing my bodily boundaries, I retain the right to say no, to withdraw consent. So in sex, for example, you consent to somebody to have sex with you, you can have sex with somebody, and then you can say, no, okay, I don't want to do it anymore. And they lose the right. But with pregnancy, it's a much, if you can't just say, you can't in your 7th month of pregnancy say, actually, I've changed my mind. There's going to be some period, unless you have a very, very extreme view that abortion should be permissible until birth. But I don't know for any reason. I don't know anybody who says abortion at will up until birth. That should be distinguished from people who think that you can have it to save your life or for various reasons. But yeah, so pregnancy involves this kind of giving up of your bodily boundaries for this long period of time, which differ and not being able to revoke it. So then that gives us the question, right? How do you recognize the pregnant person as as having value in what they are doing for the fetus? How do you recognize that they have, they are of use to the fetus and that this matters, while still treating them as an end, when that's not going to look quite like the way we treat people as ends when they're not pregnant, because it's not going to involve the same kind of control over bodily integrity and other things.
Thank you so much.
At the end of your presentation, you mentioned the importance of kind of recognizing the value that pregnancy has in parenthood. How do you think, kind of looking at countries like Japan that are particularly struggling with kind of declining birth rates, how do you think that kind of changes how pregnancy is valued, and also how people who have the potential for pregnancy are valued kind of within wider society?
Oh, that's such an interesting question. I mean, declining birth rates are quite complicated. I had my children about 10 years ago and more than that. I sometimes wonder whether I would have children now, just because various things that weren't so salient to me then now seem really salient. So climate change just seems so much more present, and that can affect your decision about whether to have children, either because you think, oh, I don't want to bring another kind of person who's going to use resources into this world, or because you think, I don't want to bring somebody into this world in this state. So there are lots of good reasons not to have children at the moment. And it's really important to recognize that not everybody should, like not having children is a perfectly good choice. What I think we need to do is to recognize how that for many people, having children is an important part of a good life for them, that children benefit all of us, and so we need to make space for having children and ensure that parents aren't the only people who bear the costs of having children. And of course, if you're in a country with declining birth rates, then it becomes kind of more important, that there becomes more of a case to take more of the costs of having children, so that when somebody's deciding whether to have children or not, they might be more likely to decide to have it. But I don't think we should be in a situation where we're sort of saying people should be kind of really encouraged to have children in a way that becomes coercive, or we should be sort of saying that people who have children are kind of special or especially valuable, because that really feeds into it's a form of reproductive objectification, because it's saying that your value is really determined by whether you're going to have children or not. And I think we see a lot of that. We see a lot of an assumption that women's function is to have children. And I think that feeds into the sodium valproate thing.
Okay, I can see 2 questions, so let's go 3. Let's go on that side first, and then 2 at the back on the other side.
Thank you so much for your talk. So I think one thing that really came through is just that pregnancy is weird and strange in so many different ways. And one that you just mentioned right now is that there's also an existential calculus to giving birth, which is, do I want to bring a life into this world? And is it right that I am giving birth to someone who will suffer as well as feel joy? And I thought it was interesting that during your thought experiment, pregnancy was portrayed as the plate that you gift to someone else, which will, feed them for the day. But when you give birth, you're also subjecting someone to suffering. And I wonder if you believe that there's also a case to be made that when we subject someone to suffering as well as, good things in life, we owe them certain obligations, like, for example, not smoking, taking care of our body and prioritizing their welfare while they rely on us physically.
I mean, I think I'm an optimist, and so I do think that life is a gift. If you're, under good circumstances, life is a gift, and the benefits of life outweigh the risks. I also think that not all pregnancy is kind of fully voluntary, and it's really complicated to try and say, okay, we're gonna only apply these standards to the people who have voluntarily brought children into the world, because then you have to ask really intrusive questions. I think that the cost of, so ensuring that you don't ever become pregnant is very costly. It involves giving up on some significant human goods. You can become pregnant even though you've done everything that you should have done to avoid pregnancy. You can become pregnant as a result of rape, where you haven't even done anything to create the pregnancy. So I'm wary of putting too much of the kind of parental duties on the sort of choice to become pregnant. If we had really good access to abortion, then we might be able to say that in choosing to remain pregnant, you've made a voluntary choice that puts you on the hook. But that would be complicated by the fact that I think reasonable people do not see abortion as a kind of ethical choice, as something that they can do. So there are just really complicated questions about the kind of how much responsibility we want to say. I do think that you can acquire obligations in virtue of relationships that you stand in, even though they're not fully voluntary. So I'm definitely on board with the idea that people who are pregnant are going to have some obligations to their fetus. But I think that working out exactly what those obligations are is really complicated, and it's not going to be. I don't think it's going to be the case that we're going to say, you chose to bring this fetus into the world, so you've got to give it the optimal start in life. I think that's too demanding in various ways.
Okay, so we've got two more questions right at the back, and I think they'll have to be the last two. We've got about 5 minutes left, so if you could keep the question brief and the answer too.
I'm sorry I was late, so I might have missed this. But when you talked about having an incomplete boundary is not all bad, or that to accommodate others, there's goods in accommodating others, do you find yourself thinking beyond to, say, the status of caregivers or the potential for the collective, or also to challenge the idea that autonomy, which has been both historically and now in sort of self-help, the idea to be independent, autonomous as something to strive for, is actually open to challenge?
So what I think pregnancy does is really bring out something that's true generally, which is that human beings aren't these self-sufficient, independent islands. And once we start recognizing it in pregnancy, we'll see it in lots of other areas. And I think that, but I think that the puzzle one of the fundamental puzzles of human life is how do we get the balance right between independence and individuality and the collective. So I think pregnancy brings that out, and then we see it in lots of other places.
Very good. Last one then.
Thank you, Professor, for opening our minds to this very unique, complex topic on pregnancy and philosophy. I'm very intrigued by your thought experiment idea of sharing up the plates, like the popular trolley experiment. There are many iterations to the trolley problem. And as I was thinking about pregnancy and your factory plate thought, it becomes your notion that pregnancy is relentless. So person A is not just sharing the plate for the night, but rather sharing the plate for 9 months. We have to acknowledge that. And 2, person B has no choice whatsoever being the fetus, right? So with that in mind, we may be quick to realize that why are we assuming so much blame on person A to choose not to have coffee for a good 9 months, right? Then we come to realize that, oh, it's because person B might die from coffee allergy. It got me thinking about drunk driving. Drunk driving, no matter when we do it, as a society, we look down on it, we have laws against it. So in this context, in this iteration to your plate thought experiment, what do you think about drunk driving, and what does that reveal about our problem in pregnancy?
So the big difference between pregnancy and drunk driving is that you can drink and not drive. So when you're not pregnant, it's possible to restrict the activity that you want to do to a time and a place where it's not going to affect others. We can also think about, when people have peanut allergies. If someone has a peanut allergy, then I can eat my peanuts when I'm not near them, in most situations. So I think that the reason why pregnancy is unique is that it has this extended period. And also I do think it matters that you are only affecting, your behavior only has an effect on the fetus because it's affecting your own body, which the fetus is using. So I think the drunk driving analogy, you would have to make it the case that, gosh, I don't think I can do it on the fly, but we need to change the case so that the car is only dangerous to the potential victim because the potential victim is using the car in some way. So, yeah, but I can't do it on the fly. I'm sorry.
Well, plenty more to think about. I'm afraid we're timed out. Apologies to those of you who have questions and who didn't get a chance to answer them, but let's close by thanking Fiona once again.